If the nations of this hemisphere should fail to meet their commitments against outside communist penetration, then I want it clearly understood that this government will not hesitate in meeting its primary obligations, which are to the security of our nation.
Through the creation of a communist regime, Joseph Stalin, dictator of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, brought together a band of communist leaders who threatened the very core of the United States democracy. This clash of ideologies created a striking rivalry that occurred between the United States and the USSR in what was known as the Cold War from 1947 to 1991. Democracy is a form of government in which policy matters are decided by the people, respecting individuals' right to create political parties and dispute in elections. Communism takes control of all the industry and capital in the country, and one political party holds control of the government. As an ideology, communism holds a belief in that the proletariat capitalist system. This greatly conflicts with the United States' strong emphasis on capitalism, especially when dealing with other countries. In an attempt to outshine the other's ideology, the United States and USSR began encouraging other countries to adopt their own forms of government. Fidel Castro, leader of Cuba, declared that Cuba was a socialist state, influenced by the USSR's employment of communism under Nikita Khrushchev. Consequently, socialist policies were enforced by Castro, such as the nationalization of oil refineries, so that the United States retaliated by reducing the brown sugar import quota from Cuba, fearing the radical government would influence Americans. This furthered tensions already existing between the United States and Cuba. Castro used the Platt Amendment, allowing U.S. intervention as well as a sugar quota reduction to justify his response, which was to nationalize private businesses owned by the U.S. base in Cuba, such as Coca-Cola, without any form of compensation. Tensions continued to grow until it would eventually reach a point in which Eisenhower devised a plan with the CIA to overthrow Castro's communist regime through an invasion. Eisenhower's plan involved the establishment of training camps by the CIA in Guatemala to train an army in guerrilla warfare, developing an army force inept enough to overthrow the Castro regime. This army was comprised of U.S. soldiers and exiled counter-revolutionary Cubans who took residence in the Miami region. The Cuban exiles formed an armed unit of the guerrilla force known as Brigade 2506, trained by additional instructors from the Army Special Forces, Air Forces, and Air National Guard, on an island privately leased by the CIA. President Eisenhower had planned to bring down the Castro regime in a way to appeal to the Cuban people and make it appear like it wasn't a U.S. intervention. They created 4 assets: a political opposition group, an intensive anti-Castro propaganda, a covert force of anti-Castro Cubans to carry out missions in Cuba and gather intelligence, and an adequate paramilitary force that could train outside of Cuba. By doing so, the U.S. could intervene in Cuban affairs without angering the rest of Latin America and the world. This U.S. intervention had goals of getting Castro out of power and remove communism from Cuba to restore a capitalist government. The plan involved 3 phases with the purpose of forcing the resignation of Castro. Phase 1 outlined the destruction of a series of Castro's combat aircraft to prevent all potential retaliatory capabilities by the time the brigade reached the base. Eisenhower planned to achieve this by disguising U.S. aircraft piloted by the brigade as FAR, or Fuerza Aérea Revolucionaria, aircraft which belonged to Cuba's Air Force. With this disguise, the brigade would bomb 3 of Castro's Air Force bases 2 days prior to the invasion itself. In Joseph L. Shannon's opinion, the decision to bomb the base prior to the actual assault was a foolish move, as it would give Castro ample time to prepare for the invasion as he had been expecting from the tensions between the U.S. and Cuba. Phase 2 aimed to destroy the remainder of the combat aircraft from Phase 1 by using bombs dropped by the brigade pilots over the opposing base to prevent counterfire during the invasion. Finally, Phase 3 outlined the invasion itself. The U.S. planned to infiltrate and invade the Cuban military base on the Trinidad beaches through sea and air, securing reliable defenses and an escape plan. Before the plan could be carried out, President Eisenhower suffered a congestive heart failure and died, opening up the presidential seat to John F. Kennedy. Increasing tensions between Cuba and the U.S. was revealed in Kennedy's changing opinion on Castro from 1959 to 1960. Historian Trumbull Higgins compared Kennedy's previously passive opinion on Castro in 1959, pushing him off as a simple problem in the Eisenhower administration. but he ran for president in 1960, he drastically changed his opinion on Castro as a source of maximum danger and immediate action must be taken. The aggressive stance against Castro intensified conflict between the two governments. John F. Kennedy had continued the plan initially made by President Eisenhower, even though ill-advised to land a force of 1,400 anti-Castro Cuban refugees in Cuba in hopes of sparking an uprising among the people. Things took an unexpected turn when Castro made a sudden show of arms. Landing before the dawn of April 17, 1961, the invading force was almost immediately pinned down by Cuban forces. U.S. forces quickly found themselves outnumbered and outgunned by Cuban armed forces, taking damage first to their sea vessels, followed by their damage to their aircrafts. The lack of air or naval artillery supported contributed to the swift takedown of the forces. It was not long before the U.S. officially suffered utter defeat by Castro. Within 3 days, any hope of uprising was suppressed and captured. The failure of this expedition was attributed to the U.S. lack of support, inadequate tactical plans and small size of invading force, and poor management. The launch attack in itself was a mistaken judgment, as previous attempts to have relations with Latin America proved to be ineffective. Therefore, a chance at general uprising was highly unlikely. With this invasion, Castro's power increased in Cuba, solidifying Cuba as a socialist state under the Soviet Union. This fiasco had quite a few consequences. The operation had raised moral issues surrounding the United States' involvement in Latin America around the world. America was now being judged on a double standard, put in a higher standard in comparison to other powers. This later caused conflict for Kennedy when launching his Alliance for Progress in 1961. Latin America generally distrusted the U.S. and saw it as just another U.S. attempt to dominate Latin America. The failed invasion also strengthened Castro's administration, which proceeded to openly proclaim its intent to adopt socialism and pursue closer ties to the Soviet Union. Effectively securing his stronghold, Castro became a proclaimed hero against U.S. imperialism. A major issue that arose from the Bay of Pigs project was the agreement Castro made with the Soviet Union to place missiles in Cuba, which later developed into the Cuban Missile Crisis between the U.S. and Cuba, the closest the two world powers had ever been to engaging in thermonuclear conflict. By placing these missiles in Cuba, the Soviet Union capitalized on Kennedy's mistake with the Bay of Pigs. As backup, the U.S. responded to the missiles placed in Cuba by placing missiles in Turkey and Italy. This led to the Brinkmanship standoff, a situation that mutually assured destruction. Therefore, they compromised and eventually removed the missiles to prevent this destruction. Castro had captured 1,189 men of the brigade and held them prisoners in Havana. In exchange for the prisoners, Castro demanded $62 million ransom, and due to a mass trial, negotiations dragged up until 1962. Unable to pay the ransom amount, Attorney General Robert Kennedy made pleas to the officers of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association and the baby food manufacturers to eventually come to a compromise. Castro accepted $53 million worth of food and drugs in exchange for the prisoners rather than the demanded amount of money. The first plane with returning prisoners landed on December 23, 1962. While President Kennedy did come to this temporary compromise to patch up his mistake in this attack, the conflict with Cuba was not over, as he still promised to free Cuba almost right after the whole ordeal was resolved. To resolve the conflict within the U.S., the blame was placed on the CIA. In some cases, the president rewrote accounts to avoid the blame and put it on the CIA.